their dynamics and evolution. Richard started off his academic career at Sheffield and then moved through ETH Zurich, Liverpool John Moores, and is now returned to Sheffield as a Royal Society Dorothy Hodgkin Fellow and Lecturer. So today Richard will be talking to us about the star forming environment on planetary systems. So Richard, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us, and please, whenever you're ready.
All right, thanks very much, Ed. Hi, everyone. So you may know I was scheduled to turn up in person at Queen Mary at the end of March, but unfortunately, COVID-19 had other ideas. So it's really nice to be talking to you, albeit from my home in Sheffield. What I'm going to do today is sort of give you a bit of an overview of, I guess, the main strand of research that I work on, which is trying to understand what, if anything, the influence of the star-forming environment is on both the formation and the evolution of planetary systems, and to try and kind of place this, place our solar system in the context of all the other exoplanetary systems. And before I get going, I just want to kind of highlight that a lot of this work has been done by PhD students, Christina Schottler and Emma Daffen-Powell, and also former students Rana Nicholson and Tim Lichtenberg. But also as well, a couple of undergraduates have been involved in some of this work as well, so Bethany Wooten and Hayley Alcock. So just to kind of set the scene, one of the kind of questions that is a sort of a side issue or side problem when we're talking about the Earth environment planetary systems is that we don't really understand or know where most stars, like the sun and the galactic disk, are born. It might be that they all come from sort of fairly low density, diffuse, so large radii star-forming regions. These are often called associations. So formally, a stellar association is something that where the total energy of the system is positive. So this is unbound. And so the idea behind that is that these stellar associations may just gently disperse into the galactic field on timescales of a few million years. Or alternatively, most stars may form in very dense environments that are often referred to as clusters. A cluster formally is a system of stars which is gravitationally bound, so total negative energy. But it's actually, as you can imagine, very difficult to actually distinguish this observationally. And so a lot of the time, we just define a cluster as being something that's particularly dense or contains a certain number of stars. But you have a whole range, even if you talk about a star cluster, you have a whole range of things. So on the lower left of the slide is 30 Doradus, which is a star cluster in the Large Magellanic Cloud. And that is incredibly dense, probably going to form eventually something akin to a globular cluster. So a very, very dense, very massive cluster contains probably at least 10,000, if not more, stars. And then the image on the right-hand side is something that people who study kind of galactic star formation are interested in. So this is the Orion Nebula cluster. And the reason that people are so interested in this is that this is the closest star-forming region to the sun that contains massive stars, so O-type stars, things more massive than about 17 solar masses that produce H2 regions, ionize their surroundings, and impart a lot of feedback back into their local environment. And I'll talk about those and their effects on planet formation a lot more later on. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there's no sort of single type of star-forming environment. It's not like all stars form in a star-forming region with a single stellar density. If that were the case, then we could say something about the likely effects on planetary systems. And it's actually difficult, really, to kind of put your finger on a density regime where you can say, okay, below this stellar density, there are no interactions or no stellar interactions of any importance. So often people say, okay, a very dense star-forming region or a very dense cluster has to have more than a few hundred stars per cubic parsec. The graph that I'm showing here is the cumulative distribution of the stellar density around young stellar objects in the nearest star-forming regions to the sun, so within about 500 parsecs. But you can see that the stellar densities are shown by the black continuous line there, and you can see there's a wide range of densities. So some star-forming regions are quite dense, and others are fairly low density. So just for reference, the density that the sun sits in today in the galaxy is down at about 0.1 stars per cubic parsec. So this is kind of a, most star-forming regions have densities higher than that, but some of them have densities that are not much higher than that. If you're talking about interactions that would disrupt the planetary system, then to directly disrupt the planetary system, i.e. to change the orbits of the planet as they're forming, then you're probably looking at requiring stellar densities of more than a few hundred stars per cubic parsec. But something that I'll talk a lot about later on is that if you're in a star-forming region with massive stars, then the feedback that those massive stars give out, in particular their photoionizing feedback, is strong enough to disrupt and evaporate protoplanetary disks, and in particular the gas from those disks. And in order for that to happen, you actually don't require very high stellar densities at all. You can have a stellar density of a few stars per cubic parsec, and you'll see some significant damage to the protoplanetary disks. If, again, the caveat being here that the star-forming region needs to have massive stars for this to happen. So one thing you can do is you can try and kind of guess at the typical density of the star-forming region, because that kind of gives us an idea of whether or not in general, the star formation environment is important for understanding planet formation and evolution of planetary systems. So what I'm showing here is the evolution of density. So this is the average density in n-body simulations of the evolution of star-forming regions. So the gray lines here are the individual median densities for a single star-forming region, and we've run these simulations so lots and lots of times to get an idea of the sort of the statistical spread. And these simulations start with very, very high densities. But a star cluster or star-forming region is a collisional system, a gravitational collisional system. And so in order to try and relax, the star-forming region, the stars within the region undergo lots and lots of interactions. And that has the net effect of causing the star-forming region to expand. So what you see here is you can start off with very high densities, 10 to the 4 solar mass per cubic parsec, for example. And then in a very short space of time, you can then attain reasonably low stellar densities. So, few to 10 solar mass per cubic parsec. The black points on the diagram are the measured densities for some nearby star-forming regions. And the point that I'm making with this is that it's actually difficult to really pinpoint the initial stellar density, which is the density that's important for planet formation, if you only know about the present day stellar density. So for example, if I were to start these simulations at much lower stellar densities, then the evolution of those star-forming regions is not as drastic, so they don't expand as much. But what you can see is if you focus on the black points here, you can see that I can start with very high stellar densities and attain low stellar densities, or I can start with kind of fairly low, fairly average stellar densities and still kind of reproduce the observations at a given point in time. And so this has led people to say, okay, well, we think most star-forming regions form with incredibly high stellar densities, which would be, detrimentally affect planet formation. But without knowing the initial stellar density, at first sight, you can't really say anything about the sort of most important density. So how do we get around this? Well, we try and kind of run a combination of sort of simulations, compare simulations to observations, and to come up with measures of quantifying both the spatial and the velocity structure in these regions. So what I'm showing here, I hope this animation comes through over the connection. So what this is this is an n-body simulation of the star-forming region, and we set it up with spatial and kinematic substructure to try and mimic the initial conditions that we observe in star-forming regions. And if you do that, then the region is out of dynamical equilibrium to begin with, and it tries to attain dynamical equilibrium as quickly as it can. So what you see in the animation is that the primordial structure in that star-forming region is wiped out very, very quickly, and the stars, by and large, fall into the central potential well of that star-forming region. The red points that you saw there were the most massive stars, and they are initially just distributed randomly in the simulation, but after about 1 million years, they've all fallen into the central regions. This is a phenomenon called dynamical mass segregation, and mass segregation, where the most massive stars are preferentially found in the center of star clusters, is observed in quite a few systems. So what we can do with these simulations is we can quantify the evolution of the spatial structure and the spatial distribution of the stars. There's different ways of doing this. The way we do it is using this thing called the Q parameter. So the Q parameter basically constructs a minimum spanning tree. So this is a graph between a set of points that joins all the points via the shortest possible total length, total path length, where there are no closed loops. And you may be familiar with minimum spanning trees. They're used a lot in sort of things like the traveling salesman problem, and used a lot in kind of communications optimization, that kind of thing. So the Q parameter works by drawing minimum spanning tree between all the points in the distribution. So in this case, these are the stars in the star-forming region. And then you divide the average length of the minimum spanning tree by the average length of the complete graph. So the complete graph is the lines that join all the points in the distribution to each other. And as you can imagine, this looks incredibly messy, and it's not really worth showing the slide. But if you make this relatively straightforward calculation, this ratio of the two lengths, then for a substructure distribution, such as the one you see here, you see that the Q parameter is low. So it has a value of about 0.4 for this particular distribution. But if I run the Q parameter on a stellar distribution that looks something like the end point of that simulation that I showed, then what you find is the Q parameter is much higher. It has values of approaching 1 or just over 1. And so what that enables us to do is to then kind of follow the structure of the star-forming region over time and quantify it in a sort of a semi-meaningful way. And so when we do that, going back to the slide that I showed to begin with, you see that we can trace the evolution of the median density of star-forming region, but we can also trace the evolution of the structure. So the plot on the right-hand side of this is showing the evolution of this Q parameter over time. So to begin with, the simulations are substructured and they have very low Q parameters. And then as the simulation evolves over time, then the substructure is erased and you reach Q parameters of above unity. So the horizontal red dashed line that you see in the right-hand panel, that's the boundary between a substructure distribution and a smooth distribution. And I'm plotting the same observational data points on this graph of Q parameter versus time. And so one thing you see is that for that particular set of simulations, the simulations are inconsistent with the observational data. Okay, so we might be able to fit some of the stellar densities, but we can't fit the values for this Q parameter. Aside from perhaps one observation data point here, that's the Orion Nebula cluster. Okay. If we alternatively make our star-forming regions less dense to begin with, so we decrease the density by a couple of orders of magnitude, and then do the same thing, so what we see is that the simulations are much more consistent with the observational data. So we think that this is a sort of a kind of a crude kind of way of putting limits on the initial density of the star-forming regions. Basically, if a region is dense to begin with, this initial substructure is erased, and you tend to kind of smooth, centrally concentrated initial morphologies. And so this is kind of a good starting point, but like anything, you'd like kind of more pieces of evidence for this. So one thing you can do, and we're starting to do using the Gaia satellite, is we can fold in information on the velocities of stars. And Gaia, for those of you not familiar with it, is basically it's measuring the positions of millions or billions of stars in the galaxy. And really, its kind of prime goal is to kind of measure the sort of structure of the Milky Way. But there's some sort of nice kind of side projects that are kind of using Gaia. And one of them is to understand so-called runaway or walkaway stars from star-forming regions. So in the animation I showed, you may have seen stars being ejected at very high velocities. And these stars are often termed runaway stars. And they come about because, you know, when you have very strong dynamical encounters, typically the lower mass stars, not always, but usually the lower mass stars in the encounter are ejected from the cluster at high velocities. And we can quantify this in both simulations, but now we can quantify this for observed star-forming regions. So this is some work that Christina Schottler, one of my PhD students, has been working on in the last couple of years. So the first thing Christina did was basically take the simulations that I showed earlier on, and then look at the both the number of stars that were ejected and their velocity distributions as a function of the initial conditions. So Christina varied the initial stellar density, she varied the amount of kinematic and spatial substructure, and she varied the virial ratio of the system as well. And just to kind of summarize that in a couple of plots, basically what Christina found is that the main parameter that's of interest is the initial stellar density. So you're probably not surprised to know from what I've told you so far, the higher the stellar density, the more ejected stars you get, and you can then kind of, you know, for a given time in the simulation, try and compare that to observed star-forming regions. And this is where Gaia comes in. So Christina did this. So she went to ESTEC to work with one of the Gaia mission scientists, Jos de Bruin. And with Jos and his team, Christina basically came up with these. So these are color magnitude diagrams in which you plot an isochrone for, you know, a rough kind of upper limit for the age of the star-forming region you're interested in. So this is the Orion Nebula cluster. And the red points with the error bars, they are candidate runaway stars. So these are runaway stars that in 2 dimensions with the Gaia data can be traced back to having an origin within the Orion Nebula cluster. And they're also of an age that's kind of commensurate with the age of the star-forming region. These orange points here, I'll come back to in a minute. So these are stars that can be traced back to the Orion Nebula cluster, but are not consistent with the age of the Orion Nebula cluster. So they may just be stars that happen to be kind of, you know, passing through, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. And so it's quite a difficult job to disentangle what's actually originated in the cluster versus stuff that just might be just kind of wandering through. And you know, this is where the Gaia data really come into their own for doing this. So the plot on the left-hand side is showing candidate runaway stars, and the plot on the right is showing walkaway stars. Now, we've been able to see runaway stars from star-forming regions for a long time. Due to their very high velocities, they show up in kind of proper motion surveys that are taking over, you know, time span of a decade or so. But the walkaway stars, because they're moving more slowly, are much more difficult to pinpoint. So this is really where Gaia is kind of shifting the kind of the you know, the goalposts, as it were. And so what Christina is showing on the right-hand plot here is candidate walkaway stars, and you can see that there are far more walkaway stars than runaway stars, and that makes sense from a dynamical point of view. So the slide that I showed before, you can see actually that doesn't show what I'm trying to say. Just take my word for it. You know, dynamic interactions produce more kind of slow-moving stars or moderate velocity stars than fast-moving stars. And if you kind of sort of really kind of then fold in extra information. So for some of these stars, we actually have radial velocity information as well. And there you can really kind of pinpoint a subset of stars back to the Orion Nebula cluster. And so Christina did this, and you know, for the purposes of this talk, all this is doing is constraining the initial stellar density. And so we think that the Orion Nebula cluster is there's at least a few hundred solar masses per cubic parsec in terms of its stellar density. And so if you recall, this is at the high end of the velocities of the densities that would certainly disrupt the initial stages of planet formation. And just one thing I want to highlight before actually getting to talking about the effects on planet formation is that some of these stars that are older than the Orion Nebula cluster, these appear to be visiting stars. Christina had a look at them, and some of them have evidence for, or tenuous evidence for a protoplanetary disk. And so what we think is happening here is that these stars have been ejected from one star-forming region and have then encountered the Orion Nebula cluster. Now, whether or not, the ejection from the first system and then the kind of visiting another dense stellar system, i.e. the Orion Nebula cluster, whether or not that's affected the protoplanetary disk, we don't really know, but it can sort of illustrates the idea that, a star with a planetary system may undergo more than one dense stellar environment in its very early stages. So why is this kind of important for planet formation? Well, I think most people would agree that planet formation, if it's not finished early on, it certainly starts very early on in the star's life. And so we've got the now kind of classic image of the HL Tor system taken with ALMA. So, this is a very young star in a nearby star-forming region, and the disk displays these features which may or may not indicate ongoing planet formation. And the plot on the right-hand side is nearly 20 years old now. So this is the fraction of stars in star-forming regions that display an infrared excess in their spectral energy distribution as a function of the age of the star-forming region. And so the interpretation of this infrared excess is, of course, that they have a fairly massive circumstellar or protoplanetary disk. And the interpretation of this plot is that this protoplanetary disk doesn't last very long. So it's either forming planets, or it's being destroyed, or perhaps a combination of the two. And one thing I like to show the undergraduate students that I teach star and planet formation is how things move on. So you get kind of better data, more data, and also the perception of the field kind of moves on as well. So you'll notice on this recent work by Richard et al., which is measuring the disk fraction in lots more star-forming regions, essentially finding the same result as Heisch et al. But notice that the y-axis of this plot is now just called the disk fraction, okay? Because we're fairly confident that this is indicating the presence of protoplanetary disks. So, given that we know that stars form by a range of stellar densities, then what could the effects be on protoplanetary disks? And one of the things that I've kind of been working on a lot in the last couple of years is the idea that disks can be destroyed by the radiation from massive stars. And I mentioned that the Orion Nebula cluster is the closest star-forming region to the sun that contains massive stars. And this is now a famous image, I believe, is one of the first images to come from the Hubble Space Telescope following the correction of the optics system. And it's basically a zoom in of the Orion Nebula cluster, and then we've zoomed in on young stars that appear to have these sort of ionization fronts, around them, which we think is, indicates the presence of a disk structure that is being ionized by the radiation field from massive stars. And if you kind of suspend your belief a little bit, you can kind of just about convince yourselves that these ionization fronts point towards the location of the most massive stars in the Orion Nebula cluster. And so what we did is we kind of modeled the evolution of star-forming regions, and we don't include disks directly in the n-body simulations because it's too computationally expensive to do this. But luckily for us, some people working very hard on models of photoevaporation disks provided a very nice set of models where we can then look at the destruction of protoplanetary disks sort of after the fact of our n-body simulation. So we kind of do a post-processing analysis on these disks. And so what we do is we simply calculate the flux from the massive stars that's incident at each low mass star, and then work this forward in time and use Tom's models to determine how much of the disk, if any, is left over after a given amount of time. And so the main feature of Tom's models, and I'm sure Tom can correct me if I'm misrepresenting it at all, is that the gas content in these disks is readily destroyed for relatively modest radiation fields. You only need a few OB stars to have a very destructive radiation field that's in some cases thousands or tens of thousands of times higher than the radiation flux in the interstellar medium. And in this plot, Tom is showing that the gas content of the disks is destroyed very rapidly. The dust content of the disk kind of is just, some of it is evaporated, but most of it stays where it is. And so we took Tom's models and sort of put them in our in-body simulations. And so this is some work that Rana Nicholson did. And so Rana basically found that if you have full evaporation, then you have a very strong decrease in the fraction of disks around young stars. And I'm not sure if, I'm not sure if this is slightly misleading. So we're plotting the evolution of the fraction of disks for simulations with different initial conditions. So these have different amounts of spatial substructure. But the main difference between the two panels is that on the left-hand panel, these are kind of low density star-forming regions, fairly low density, tens of solar masses per cubic parsec. And on the right-hand side, we've got fairly dense star-forming regions, so kind of commensurate with the density in the Rhine Nebula cluster, so 100 solar masses per cubic parsec. And we've also plotted the kind of observed disk fractions in nearby star-forming regions as well. And what we find is that these disks are destroyed very, very rapidly in these star-forming regions. So these plots are showing different stellar densities, and these plots here, we're changing the initial disk radius. So on the left-hand side, we're showing the evolution of disk fraction for disks that are all initially 10 AU, and then on the right-hand side, we're showing the evolution of disk fraction for disks that are initially 100 AU. And so, just want to point out, if you start off with a disk that's kind of more than a few tens of AU, you rapidly lose all of the gas from that disk. And so one of the things we're looking at is whether or not this is constraining the initial conditions of the solar system. If the solar system is going to form in a star-forming region where there are massive stars, then you need the initial protosolar disk to only be a few tens of AU. Otherwise, you don't have any gas left over to form Jupiter and Saturn. So this is some work that is currently under review. We're hoping it's going to be out early next year. One of the things that you often see in observations of these kind of things is an apparent dependence on the mass or fraction of disks as a function of their distance from the ionizing star. And what we're showing here is the mass of a disk as a function of the distance from the most massive star in the Orion Nebula cluster. And so what you see is what appears to be a fairly strong correlation between the mass of the disk and the distance from the ionizing source. And the interpretation being that the closer you are to the ionizing source, the more of the disk is going to be destroyed and the less massive the disk will be. That was in the Orion Nebula cluster. This is in Sigma Orionis, so it's another star-forming region that contains a fairly massive star. And again, when you're close to the ionizing source, the disk masses appear to be fairly low, and they don't appear to contain any very much gas. So in the plot on the right-hand side, where you see a blue circle around the point, that is indicating the detection of CO, so a tracer of gas in the disk. So this is kind of an established idea that the further you are from the ionizing source, the more massive the disk is likely to be. I just want to kind of throw a little bit of kind of water on that fire a little bit in the following slides, and just talk about the perspective of someone who just works on star cluster dynamics. Okay. So the first thing you've got to realize with these plots is that they're 2D projections of a 3D distribution, okay? So imagine, for the sake of argument, I have a star cluster, and I've deliberately modeled a kind of very simple one here. So this is just a kind of a synthetic cluster where we've said that there's an ionizing source in the very center of the cluster, and within a certain radius, all of the disks around the low mass stars have been destroyed by this ionizing radiation. So in 2D, okay, then what you see is that sorry, in 3D, I should say, what you see is that, you know, the closer you are to the most massive star, the more of the disk you're likely going to deplete, okay? And this is kind of shown by the red points and the lines, okay? So the idea is the circles in this plot are the initial masses, and the plus signs are the final masses. And this is in 3D. But if you try to mimic what an observer would see, that of course would be a 2D projection. And so when you do that, what you see is a lot of foreground and background stars that kind of get in the way. And so all of a sudden, from going from, you know, what appeared to be a kind of a correlation between, you know, the most, you know, the mass of the disk, or whether or not the star still has a disk, and its distance to the ionizing source, you immediately see that when you have a 2D projection, you're getting sort of line of sight effects, and you're getting quite a bit of confusion. So we thought, oh, this is fairly interesting, and so we kind of take this further and and have a look at our n-body simulations, where we model disk destruction after the simulation is finished. And so what we're showing here is the disk mass as a function of distance from the massive star. Now the black points are the data for n-body simulation, and then the various colored symbols are observed star regions. So for example, the orange points are the Orion Nebula cluster. The blue points are Sigma Orionis. The pink points are NGC 2024. And so what we see is that actually, the first thing to notice is when you have a dense stellar environment like the ONC, you get a significant amount of expansion. Okay, the star forming regions expand. And so the first thing we've noticed is it's very difficult to exactly match the observed positions of the low mass stars with disks. And one thing that you get with kind of 2D projection effects is that things appear closer to the ionizing star than they actually are. But one thing we see is that there's no correlation between the mass of the disk and the distance from the massive star in the disks that are remaining in our n-body simulations. And we've tried changing the mass of the disk. So the lower panel basically is changing the disk mass. So these disks are 1% of the host star's mass rather than 10%. And as you might imagine, in that scenario, you just destroy more of the disks, and so you have even less of a correlation. And so what's the reason for this? Why can't we reproduce this in the n-body simulations? Well, we think that this is because stars move around, okay? So a star that is close to an ionizing source and loses its disk will then eventually wander off in the star-forming region. So we often talk about the dynamical timescale of a star-forming region as being something called a crossing time. And the sort of average kind of motion of stars around the star-forming region is often defined as a crossing time. So these stars are moving around on kind of timescales of order about 0.1 million years. And so after a while, the star that has its disk destroyed moves somewhere else. And so the right-hand panel in this slide is basically showing the distribution of disks that are remaining as a function of distance from the ionizing star. And that's shown by the black histogram. And then also the distribution of stars that did have a disk, but the disk has been totally destroyed by photoevaporation. And you can see that this is essentially a kind of a Gaussian distribution. So it's just sort of, it's just random motion of the stars around the cluster. So we are really struggling to find a correlation between disk mass and distance from the ionizing star, simply because the stars in a region move around on very, very short timescales. And so when we're not really convinced that this observational trend is attributable really to ionization destruction from ionizing stars alone. So let's say, for the sake of argument, you can survive the disks around these stars survive, and then you form a kind of a young fledgling planetary system. If you're still in the star-forming region, you're not really out of the woods yet, okay? And so one thing I'm sure a lot of you will be aware of is that the distribution of exoplanet orbits, in many cases, is very different from the orbits of planets in our own solar system. And this is, I really should update this slide. I've an up-to-date plot in my undergraduate notes, but it hasn't percolated through to my seminar yet. But this is showing the orbital eccentricity versus semi-major axis of the exoplanets up until 2014, and the eccentricity and semi-major axes of the solar system planets, shown by the red points. And you can see that in many cases, the eccentricities of the exoplanets are quite high, anywhere between 0 and 1. And also, you've got a lot of fairly massive planets that are very close into the host star, so-called hot Jupiter planets. And our sort of conventional theories of planet formation find it quite difficult to explain these planetary systems. Now, what I'm going to show is kind of I would say a partial explanation or a hypothesis for this changing the orbits of planetary systems. And basically, the idea is that if you form in a moderately dense star-forming region, so 100 stars per cubic parsec or higher, then if you initially have a planet on a circular orbit, simple interactions between passing stars can change the eccentricity and in some cases the semi-major axis and inclination of the planets in question. So this is just a very sort of simple numerical experiment where we placed every single planet around a low mass star at a distance of about 30 AU, so similar to the orbit of Neptune in the solar system. And then they're initially completely circular orbits. And so after 10 million years of evolution, you get something that looks like this. So you can raise the eccentricities to anywhere between 0 and 1. So that happens to about 20% of the planets. About 10% of the planets have their semi-major axes changed by about plus or minus 10%. So fairly significant change. And the point I would make here is that the idea is this is the outer planet in the planetary system, okay? And if you can destabilize the outer planet, the chances are you might destabilize the inner planets as well. About 10% of the planets become free floating altogether, and they go off into the star-forming region, but they can be recaptured around other stars, and these are shown by the red points in this diagram. So again, this is after 10 million years of dynamical evolution. And so we think that a small fraction of the observed exoplanets may actually be captured or stolen planets from other stars. And these planets typically have very high inclinations and fairly high eccentricities as well. There's an added complication which I haven't really touched upon yet, and that is that most stars don't form as singles, they form as multiple systems. And furthermore, the initial fraction of stars that are in multiple systems is very, very high. So we think multiple star formation is the kind of preferred or dominant outcome of star formation. So this plot is showing the frequency of multiple systems as a function of their age, right the way from the earliest kind of protostellar objects, class 0 objects, to kind of pre-main sequence, class 1, class 2 objects, right the way down to the main sequence stars. And so when we think about star formation affecting planet formation, one of the main aspects could be that stars are forming in multiple systems. Now, we can't really put a finger on how much of a problem this could or couldn't be. And the reason for this is that the statistics of binary stars in star-forming regions are very, very limited. So what I'm showing here is just kind of for illustration purposes. On the left-hand side is the orbital semi-major axis distribution of sun-like stars that have a binary companion in the galactic field. So you can see we have binaries of semi-major axes from 0.01 AU all the way out to 10 to the 5 AU. It's a huge range. But the sort of equivalent data for star form regions is shown on the right-hand side panel. And so that histogram basically is the binaries that we can observe in the Orion Nebula cluster. Now, that's not to say that there aren't binaries with semi-major axes either side of that histogram. We just don't have the data in order to probe this at the moment. And so when we talk about the effects of binaries on planets and star regions, we're really quite hamstrung by what we know, or rather what we don't know, about the properties of binary stars in young star regions. Nevertheless, we know that planets exist in binaries, and I couldn't help but kind of show this gratuitous image of a view from a planet in a binary system with two suns in the sky. This was done kind of as part of a press release for a paper that we had out a few years ago, but it's a big favorite of mine, so I can't resist the excuse to show it. But the point is that we know that planets form in binaries, and so what could the effects be on planets that form in binaries? And can we relate this to what's happening in star forming regions? So one thing that could potentially dominate in star forming regions is the so-called Kozai mechanism, or to give it its proper name, the von Zeipel-Lidov Kozai mechanism. And so the idea behind this is that if two stars form the same plane, so they're the binary system that's forming, and one of the binary stars has a planet in orbit around it, if something changes the orbital inclination of binaries, so this could quite easily be an interaction with a passing star, then what you see, or what you get, is a transfer of angular momentum from the secondary star onto the planet. And this isn't my animation, but I really like showing it. So this is the effect of the Kozai mechanism on the solar system out the giant planets. And this is done by Daniel Malmberg and Melvin Davis at Lund Observatory. So if you put the solar system in a binary that is being subjected to the Kozai mechanism, then you rapidly induce orbital oscillations in the outer planet in the system, to the extent where Neptune and Uranus cross orbits and they eject each other, or they eventually eject themselves from the solar system. And you can see that Jupiter and Saturn are put into quite strong resonance. And this is happening on a very short time scale. And so I always like to show the plot on the right-hand side here. So I finished my PhD 10 years ago, and the plot on the right is the only plot in my PhD that is still relevant or kind of, useful today. And it's basically showing that the Kozai mechanism is a strong function of stellar density. So whether or not the Kozai mechanism happens depends on how many interactions you have in the star forming region, and that really just kind of depends on the stellar densities. The higher the stellar density, the more likely you are to get this Kozai mechanism. And the plot on the left is some work by Wu and Murray. It's basically just showing that the Kozai mechanism can induce the formation of hot Jupiters. So you initially start with a planet that's at a few AU, and due to the eccentricity oscillations, that planet is then driven closer to the host star and ends up having a very small semi-major axis. And what I would say is that how often the Kozai mechanism happens and whether it can happen at all is probably a strong function of the sort of initial binary properties, which again we don't really know a lot about in nearby star forming regions. However, it's not all kind of negative. So what I'm going to do with the last sort of like 5-10 minutes is kind of point out two sort of positive effects of being born in a very dense stellar environment. So the first is something that I had worked on with an undergraduate student, Bethany Wooten, where I asked Bethany to go and look at plotting habitable zones around binary stars, and then looking at what happens in n-body simulations where the orbits of binary stars can change due to dynamic encounters. So usually when you have a binary star system, the two stars have distinct habitable zones. So what we're showing here is a binary where the most massive star is about a solar mass and the lower mass star is about 0.6 solar masses. And I've kind of gone against convention here by kind of showing the least massive star in the sort of center of the rest frame. And you can see that initially on this orbit, the two habitable zones are distinct. But if the binary suffers an encounter in the Starfall region, then what can happen is that the two stars get pushed closer together and their habitable zones end up overlapping. That's interesting because basically what happens is the lower mass star then feels some of the flux from the higher mass star, and its habitable zone is enlarged or enhanced. So you can see that if I go back to the starting point, you can see the habitable zone around the lower mass star is much, much smaller than that around the high mass star. But then when you kind of push the two stars together, the habitable zones become comparable. Now, this is not to say that a planet could happily reside in one of the habitable zones of one of these stars. The dynamical encounter that pushes the two stars close together will almost certainly destabilize the planetary system. But I thought this was just kind of a neat demonstration that not all dynamical effects in the Starfall region are necessarily detrimental for the evolution of planetary systems. And then the thing that I want to kind of sort of finish on is that we've been saying that the presence of massive stars is incredibly detrimental to the formation of gas-rich planets. But there's some evidence that the solar system was born close to or from material enriched by massive stars. So we have these things in the solar system called chondritic meteorites that are rich in the decay products of short-lived radioactive isotopes aluminium-26 and iron-60, both of which have very short half-lives, half-lives on kind of the order of the star formation timescale. And there are a few ways of producing aluminium-26, but to produce aluminium-26 and iron-60, the easiest avenue is in the insides of fairly massive stars, so more than 20 solar masses. And so the hypothesis that people come up with is that the solar system, as it was forming, was polluted by the supernova explosion of one or more massive stars, and these short-lived radioactive isotopes were incorporated in the disk around the sun. And you probably won't be surprised to find out from what I've said in the previous parts of the talk, this is very stochastic. So this is some work that Tim Lichtenberg did in his PhD, and Tim basically showed that you get a huge range of abundances of aluminium-26 in Starfall regions that have statistically the same initial conditions. So the solar system abundance is shown by the vertical dotted line, and then Tim basically went through a whole host of initial conditions for the Starfall regions, and basically found that some Starfall regions have higher than solar system values for aluminium-26, and some will have a lot lower. And this is some work I wasn't, this work, later work by Tim is something I wasn't involved in, but I'd like to show it because I think this is really cool. So Tim basically showed that for a given abundance of aluminium-26, you get a very different outcome for the final planets that form in the disk. So if you have aluminium-26, then the planets tend to be heated and they dry out. So they have a very low water content compared to planets that don't have any aluminium-26 and no radiogenic heating. And so the sort of drier planets are shown by the red points in this diagram, and they have a low water content. And the wetter planets are shown by the blue points, and they have a higher water content. And the point Tim kind of made was that for planets that have no aluminium-26 heating, you might expect that those planets basically are kind of ice worlds or kind of ocean planets that have a very kind of thick mantle, mainly made of silicates and ices, and they would have a larger radius than a planet that formed with aluminium-26 heating. And these are coined shoreline planets. And so what Tim showed in this paper was that actually the difference in planetary radii that you would get if you had heating from aluminium-26 versus no heating from aluminium-26 would actually be measurable with the Plato emission, with the caveat that you'd have to know something about the composition of these planets. So this is kind of like potentially something where we could test whether or not extrasolar planets formed with high levels of aluminium-26, and whether or not the outcome of planet formation could potentially be different in different exoplanetary systems compared to the solar system. So that's the sort of kind of whistle-stop tour of some of the kind of main issues and things that I think are interesting about the using the birth environment of stars, so the formation environment of stars to constrain the birth environment of planetary systems. And I think in general, star-forming regions are pretty hostile places, especially when you have massive stars that can completely change the makeup of protoplanetary disks, even at fairly low stellar densities. And when you have a star-forming region, dynamic interactions could potentially affect up to 50% of all planetary systems, either via direct encounters with passing stars or via secondary encounters or secondary dynamic effects from things like the von Zeipel-Lidov Kozai mechanism. But as I mentioned at the end, we think that the young solar system must have been fairly close to massive stars in order to get the quantities of aluminium-26. And the measurement of iron-60 is a little more controversial, but certainly the aluminium-26 appears to be a necessary ingredient in the formation and evolution of the solar system. So I'll stop there and happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's a very interesting talk. I think applause is always difficult, but on behalf of everybody, thank you and applause. Okay, I imagine there'll be a few. Oh yeah, I can see Tom's got a question already. Tom?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for a really, really interesting talk. I mean, obviously it's all of interest to me. It's, different angles as well. So I really learned a lot and I've got a lot to think about going forwards. I was interested in this idea about the capture of the free floating planets. Now, I think you said they can have high inclinations. Yeah, I guess you'd expect that their orbital plane will be like almost arbitrary compared to the other planets. Did you look at all at the sort of, should we actually see these things, the statistics of identifying these sort of very out of plane planets? And you'd expect a whole bunch in one plane and then maybe one doing something completely different.
Yeah, I mean, this is something. So one of the people I used to share an office with, Sasha Kwons, back in the day in ETH Zurich, and if any of you know Sasha, he spent a lot of time directly imaging exoplanets and that kind of thing. And I've asked him a few times, could we observe enough kind of exoplanets to get a kind of a statistical idea of this? And he always seems very pessimistic. But it's sort of to kind of more directly answer your question. We think, so this is work that Emma Daffin-Powell, one of my students, is just about to submit for publication. We think we can sort of separate planets that are on what we call them preserved, right? So they're orbiting their initial parent star. We think we can separate out planets that are preserved versus planets that are formed via capture versus planets that are stolen. So the difference between stolen and captured planets, a captured planet by definition has spent some time as a free floating object. Whether or not it formed around another star or just formed kind of on its own is sort of irrelevant. But we think we can kind of distinguish between captured, stolen, and preserved planets in a sort of statistical sense, right? You can plot the cumulative distribution of their orbital elements. Whether or not we could then take that and then, for a given exoplanet, work out the probability that that was either a preserved, captured, or stolen planet. I'm not sure. I haven't actually had a conversation with anyone about this, but it's something I'd be interested in following up on.
Yeah, I just wonder if there's if a prediction could be made of the number of these things you might expect in a cluster, if anything could be made, we haven't found one of these. So what is the odds that that should be the case? If, I'm not particularly a statistician, but you see those kind of tests being done.
So the number that we get is of order about 5%. So 5% of, if you take a star cluster, a simulation of star cluster, 5% of the planets will be captured or stolen. So it's pretty low, right? It's not even 10%. And these are in very, very dense star-forming regions, okay? So if you believe all stars form in very dense star-forming regions, so stellar density is more than 1,000 solar masses per cubic parsec, then it's a 5% effect. I don't think all stars form in regions that are that dense. I think it's probably a lot lower. And so then you're probably going to take that fraction down to 1%, less than 1%. So probably not. It's the answer to your question.
Okay, and anyone else? Okay, then I will ask the question while you all think of another one. So I had a very sort of, in some sense, kind of general, in some sense, naive, and probably I imagine might be a difficult question to answer. So you're talking about the different star formation environments. You got the ONC, which is very dense, and then you mentioned Eta Char and like Taurus and the other kind of much looser, less dense associations, and then the different interactions that stars or planetary disks might be subject to. Given all of this, is there a kind of a picture emerging about what kind of environments would still allow planetary systems to form and not be disrupted to the point where you would be kicking out most of your planets and maybe leaving, one hot Jupiter remaining?
Yeah, I think if the stellar density initially is less than 100 solar masses per cubic parsec, then I think that your planetary system would probably be unscathed, unless, of course, there were massive stars there, in which case you might not form Jupiter or Saturn planets. Depends where in the disk you think Jupiter and Saturn formed. So yes, for star regions with stellar densities that are lower than 100 solar mass per cubic parsec, I think planetary formation is probably unaffected, especially if there are no massive stars. However, we don't know what the initial density was for the galactic field stars like the sun. There are people who posit that the star formation rate in the galaxy was probably a bit higher when the sun was forming, and when you have a higher star formation rate, sometimes you have more dense star clusters than we have today. And so it's quite a difficult thing. I mean, I can give you a fairly good estimate of the number of star forming regions that are forming today that have high stellar densities. It's probably somewhere between 50 and 25%, but I can't really give you a good estimate of the star forming regions that the field stars formed in. I can't really tell you what the initial density of those were.
Yeah, I think it's tough because I think one of the things that we ideally would like to be able to do is to kind of take the known exoplanet population, which are all orbiting sort of old stars, a giga-year and older, where we don't know what their original environments were, and then try and kind of understand where those systems may have come from, and then understand the kind of the full evolution of those systems. But I think it's very tough. It's very tough to do. But I think what you were saying is great, actually. I think it kind of adds an extra piece of information to towards answering that. I think it's great.
So interestingly, you may be aware of this already, but there is some evidence that the sun's birth cluster is still around today. So there are sort of G-type, so solar mass stars in the M67 open cluster that have very, very similar chemistry to the sun. So more similar than if you just picked a random bunch of solar mass stars in the field. And so people have tried to kind of trace back the kind of trajectory of M67 in the galaxy and the sun's trajectory, and you can never get them to kind of meet in the right place. Now there are ways around that as well. You're probably not surprised to know. So if M67 has a collision with a giant molecular cloud, you can change the orbit of a star cluster that way. But M67 is still a fairly massive open cluster, and of course it has the same age as the sun as well. So that's one of the other constraints. But yeah, M67 would have probably been a star cluster with a couple of thousand stars in it when it was born. So if the sun formed there, then that would kind of, I think, open up a new window into this kind of this field, but currently it's unclear whether or not the sun did originate in M67.
Cool, thanks. Tom, I can see you got a second question.
I'll just check that nobody else wants to ask anything first, because I don't want to be hogging discussion. Nope. Yeah, so the other thing, so one of the really interesting things you were discussing was this, there's this trend of disk masses or disk fractions with distance from an O star, and everyone, well, lots of people, including myself, hold that up in talks as evidence for evaporation affecting disks. So one of the things I've been looking at, or have learned recently, is just how sensitive this is to how you're measuring that disk mass or that disk fraction. So, I'm currently looking at NGC 2024, and there the Heish et al. 2001 disk fraction is like 85%, but in the ALMA continuum, it's like 50%. So I just wondering if you've been applying that to a particular type of observation, or if you're just looking like the model, if there's a disk there, and yeah, I guess if that comes into it at all, the particular type of observation.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, Tom, I know very little about observations of disks. I kind of take the disk measurements, so the disk observations, kind of as read when I see them. But I'm more than happy to be kind of guided in the right direction, as it were. But yeah, I kind of take them at face value. But this trend of increasing disk mass or disk fraction with distance from ions and star, if the observation is, I'm not questioning the observation as such. I'm questioning the interpretation of the observation. I don't buy it at all, because the stars move around.
Yes, yeah, no, and I completely agree. I think it depends a bit on the scale there. So again, by the way, this is all stuff that I've learned in like the last 2 weeks. So it's not it's not that I know lots about observations or anything. It's just a new sort of thing I've been looking at. But it depends on the scale of the distance scale over which this trend is observed, I think, to some extent. So like the ONC one is actually over a very small spatial scale, so the crossing time scale is short. So the Mann et al. 2014 trend, yeah, I think definitely. But the Sigma Ori is older, but it's also over a much larger scale. So it's a bit more of a mystery there. But yeah, one thing that possibly maybe we should eventually go away and talk about this offline, but is thinking about how those trends relate to what it is that's being observed. So for both Ansdell and Mann et al., they're both of them are with ALMA. So you're looking at a particular type of dust, which there's a particular sensitivity as well, which could be coming in based on the distance of the thing from us. So yeah, it's worth having at some point maybe a think about how those factor in. In your models, there's a disk there and all of its properties, but that might not reflect what you'd observe at a certain wavelength. So anyway, something we should chat about probably later on.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, just to kind of go back to your first point about the spatial scale you're looking at. So yes, you're correct to say that Sigma Orionis is kind of a much less dense system, or some is much less compact. And it's older, but we can't match this trend. When we change the density of the simulations, we can't match this trend either. We've tried it. It really doesn't work. We probably shouldn't say this out loud, but we're struggling to get this past a referee at the moment. So I don't know. It's one of those things where it's kind of frustrating when the refereeing process is anonymous, because I think we're just talking past each other. And we kind of like to find out what exactly it is that they would like us to do. But it's one of those things. I think you just got to go through the iterations. But yeah, we can't get it. We can't reproduce it. And the result that the stars with the disks and the stars without disks move around the cluster and mix over a few crossing times. That just you can't get away from that. It just happens.
I'm not the referee, by the way.
I know.
Richard?
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for a great talk, Richard. Really enjoyed it. Quick question about Gaia and its capabilities and how that's going to change over time in terms of more data coming online. So in terms of tracing the kinematics of clusters like the ONC or other star clusters, what's going to be the long-term capability of actually tracing individual stars and trying to map that onto our understanding of how these clusters are dynamically evolving? And then how would that play into the sorts of issues you've been describing there about, for example, the radiation fields that individual stars may experience over their lifetimes by being able to essentially work backwards from the Gaia? I guess you've got radial velocity measurements, you've got obviously very good measurements on their positions on the sky, you've got in principle parallax measurements as well, you've got proper motions, all of these things that Gaia is pulling out. I mean, is it going to be useful in the long term to focus on individual clusters and reconstruct, their kinematics and then work back from that and get their dynamics, well understood?
Yes and no. I think the most kind of sort of, I would say the only negative with Gaia when you talk about star formation is that it's not an infrared instrument, so you can't really look in the really embedded star forming regions, and so you're really limited to kind of the outskirts of star forming regions. But what Christina Schuttler has been doing is basically exactly as you described with UNC. So taking some n-body simulations where we've kind of had a good guess at the initial conditions, and then trying to map those simulations to the number of ejected stars, the velocity distribution of the ejected stars. And so far, we've only done that for the ONC. We're not sure how kind of useful or easy this is going to be when you start looking at lower density star forming regions, because when you have lower densities, you have fewer ejected stars, and it then becomes a bit more degenerate. So I'm not really. Certainly, it's kind of revolutionized our idea of kinematics of star forming regions. Certainly, things on the outskirts of star forming regions. And the other great thing about proper motion is that you don't have to worry about internal orbital motions from binary stars. So this has really tripped the star cluster community up about 10 years ago. So there was this idea that all star clusters appear to be supervirial, so expanding really quickly. And the interpretation was that the gas had been removed from the star forming region, and that was causing the star forming region to kind of expand. Now, actually what was happening was that we weren't correcting for the orbital motion of binary stars in the radial velocity measurements. And so once you correct for the binary star motion, then all of these star clusters then all of a sudden became very nice virialized systems. And so we kind of couldn't really take the problem any further. So the advantage of Gaia is that because it's proper motion, you don't have to worry about, well, you have to worry a little bit about binarity, but not as much as you did. So I think the main advantage of Gaia is that it's, if you ask the right questions of the data, you can get much further than we've got previously, I think.
So it sounds like you're advocating for an infrared Gaia.
There's already people talking about this.
Right.
I haven't heard anything recently, but yes, that would be that would be a game changer in this field, definitely.
Interesting. Okay, thanks for that. It's very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, so I think if no more questions, then let's thank Richard again for a very interesting talk and very interesting discussions as well.
Thank you.
Sorry. So as usual, we'll stick around online for a little bit. So Richard, if you also have time to stick around just for a kind of informal